World War II killed more people than any event in human history. Over 70 million dead. Whole cities wiped off the map in a single afternoon. But you can trace the entire thing back to one man, a failed painter who got rejected from art school. Twice. Yeah, seriously. An art academy in Vienna looked at his drawings, told him he had no future as a painter, and turned him away. 30 years later, that same man had set the entire planet on fire. A dead body with a briefcase chained to its wrist tricked Hitler into defending the wrong country. An entire army built out of rubber and plywood fooled the Germans about the biggest invasion in history. And the most famous scientist alive signed one single letter that he spent the rest of his life calling the greatest mistake he ever made. So how did we get from a rejected art student to the deadliest war ever fought? To understand the Second World War, you first have to understand the first one. Here's Europe in 1919. Germany had just lost World War I, and the winners wanted to make absolutely sure it could never rise again. The Treaty of Versailles forced Germany to accept blame for the entire war, give up 13% of its land, hand over all its colonies, and pay 132 billion gold marks it had no possible way of affording. A French marshal named Foch read that treaty and said, "This is not peace, it is an armistice for 20 years. Everybody thought he was being dramatic. He was being precise. Because the First War hadn't put the fire out, it had just buried the embers. Then, in 1929, the embers got their air. The Great Depression swept across the world, and Germany, already buried in debt, collapsed. Banks failed. Millions lost their jobs overnight. People were burning banknotes in their stoves because the paper was worth less than firewood. And when people are starving, humiliated, and furious, they start listening to anyone who promises to make them great again. In 1933, that man became Chancellor of Germany. His name was Adolf Hitler, and his party was the Nazis. Within months, he had crushed every rival, banned every other party, and turned a struggling democracy into a total dictatorship. He blamed Germany's defeat and its misery on a hidden enemy within, especially the Jews, and he built an entire propaganda machine to repeat that lie until millions believed it. Then he started tearing up the Treaty of Versailles, one page at a time. The treaty said Germany couldn't have a real army. He built one anyway. It said German troops could never enter the Rhineland, the strip of land right here along the French border. In 1936, he marched them straight in. His own generals were terrified. If the French push back, we have to retreat. We're not ready for a war. But France did nothing. Britain did nothing. And every time Hitler took a wild gamble and got away with it, he grew bolder. In 1938, he swallowed Austria whole, not a single shot fired. Then he turned to Czechoslovakia, right here, and demanded a chunk of it where many German speakers lived. And this is where the rest of Europe made its single biggest mistake. Instead of stopping him, they tried to please him. Britain and France sat down with Hitler in Munich and basically handed him the territory, hoping it would finally satisfy his appetite. The British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, flew home, waved a piece of paper at the cameras, and announced he had secured peace for our time. 6 months later, Hitler marched in and took the rest of Czechoslovakia anyway. The paper meant nothing. A scrap of paper. Sound familiar? Now Britain and France finally understood who they were dealing with. The next name on Hitler's list was Poland, right here. And this time, they drew a line. Invade Poland, they said, and we declare war. But Hitler had one problem. Poland sits between Germany and the Soviet Union, and the last thing he wanted was to fight Russia in the East and the West at the same time. So he did something nobody on Earth saw coming. He picked up the phone and called Stalin. "Hey Stalin, I know we're supposed to be mortal enemies. You're a communist, and I've spent my whole career swearing to destroy communism. But how about this? We sign a pact promising not to fight each other, and quietly, we split Poland right down the middle. You take the East, I take the West." And the Soviet Union, the one country everyone assumed would stand up to Hitler, said yes. On August 23, 1939, the two worst enemies in Europe shook hands. With his back now covered, Hitler was ready. On September 1st, 1939, German tanks and planes came crashing into Poland. And this was a brand new kind of warfare. The Germans called it Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Instead of digging into trenches like the last war, they punched holes with massed tanks, screaming dive bombers, and infantry moving faster than anyone thought possible. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. And then, while the world's eyes were locked on the Germans, the Soviets invaded Poland from the east, exactly as the secret deal had promised. Caught between two giants, Poland was crushed in 5 weeks. And then, almost nothing happened. For nearly 8 months, Britain and France just sat behind their defenses and waited. The newspapers started calling it the phony war. France had built an enormous wall of concrete forts and guns along its German border, called the Maginot Line, and the whole country felt completely safe behind it. Nothing was getting through those guns. But Hitler never had any intention of knocking on the front door. Now it's the spring of 1940, and the war exploded back to life. First, Germany grabbed Denmark and Norway to protect the iron ore it needed to keep fighting. Then, on May 10th, the real blow landed. Everyone expected Germany to come through Belgium, exactly like the last war, so the best British and French troops rushed north to meet them head-on. But it was a trap. The main German force came smashing through the Ardennes, right here, a thick forest the French were certain tanks could never cross. The Germans went around the entire Maginot Line, raced for the sea, and trapped the whole British army and the best of the French against the coast at a town called Dunkirk. It should have been the end of the war right there. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers pinned against the water, with German tanks closing in. And then something strange happened. Hitler ordered his tanks to stop. To this day, people argue about why. And in those few precious days, Britain pulled off a miracle. They sent every boat they could find, Navy destroyers, fishing trawlers, even little pleasure yachts crewed by ordinary civilians, across the channel and back, again and again. Over 9 days, they pulled 338,000 men off that beach. They lost almost all their guns and tanks, but they saved the army that would one day come back. France was not so lucky. The Germans turned south, and on June 14th, they marched into Paris without a fight. 8 days later, France surrendered. And Hitler made it personal. Remember that French forest where Germany had signed its surrender to end World War I in that railway carriage? Hitler had the exact same carriage hauled out of the museum and set down on the exact same spot. He sat in the exact same chair the French commander had used in 1918, and he forced France to sign its surrender right there. Then he had the carriage dragged back to Berlin as a trophy. The French marshal who'd warned this was only an armistice for 20 years had been dead for 10 years. He never got to see how right he'd been. By the summer of 1940, Hitler controlled almost all of Western Europe, and only one country was left standing against him: Britain. The new British Prime Minister was a stubborn 65-year-old named Winston Churchill, and when Hitler offered peace, Churchill's answer was a flat no. So Hitler decided to invade. But to get his army across the Channel, he first had to wipe out Britain's air force. What followed was the first battle in history fought entirely in the sky, the Battle of Britain. All through the summer and autumn, German bombers came in waves, and a few hundred exhausted British pilots climbed up to meet them, over and over again. The British had one secret weapon, a new invention called radar, which let them spot the German planes while they were still far away, and send their fighters to exactly the right spot. They held. Hitler couldn't win the sky, so he could never cross the sea. Churchill said of those pilots, "Never was so much owed by so many to so few." So Hitler switched to pure terror. For months, German bombers pounded London and other cities night after night in what people called the Blitz. Around 40,000 civilians were killed in their own homes. But Britain still would not break. Bombs, though, weren't the only way to kill an island. Britain couldn't feed itself or keep fighting without supplies shipped across the Atlantic from America, and Hitler knew it. So he sent his submarines, the U-boats, out to hunt those supply ships. They prowled in packs, dozens at a time, and they were terrifyingly good at it. At the worst of it, they were sinking ships faster than the shipyards could build new ones, and Britain came genuinely close to being starved into surrender. What saved it wasn't a weapon, it was a secret. In a quiet country house called Bletchley Park, a team of British codebreakers, led by a brilliant young mathematician named Alan Turing, cracked the German code machine the enemy believed was unbreakable, the Enigma. Suddenly, Britain could read the U-boat's own orders, steer its convoys safely around the packs, and hunt the hunters. It was an invisible war, fought over scrambled radio signals instead of trenches, and it would quietly help decide everything. And here, Hitler made the same mistake that has destroyed conquerors for 1,000 years. Unable to finish off the enemy in front of him, he turned around and attacked a brand new one behind him. Now it's 1941, and the war became truly global. On June 22nd, Hitler did the unthinkable. He tore up his pact with Stalin and launched the largest land invasion in the history of the world. Over 3 million Axis soldiers poured across the Soviet border along a front stretching 1,000 miles. The operation was called Barbarossa. Stalin had been warned this was coming, by his own spies, by the British, by practically everyone. He refused to believe it, and when it finally happened, he was so stunned he vanished for days. The Germans tore through the Soviet army, taking hundreds of thousands of prisoners at a time, and by winter, they could actually see the rooftops of Moscow. And then, the same thing that destroyed Napoleon destroyed them. The Russian winter arrived. The temperature dropped to 40 below. German engines froze solid. Soldiers, still in their summer uniforms, froze to death in the snow. And right outside Moscow, fresh Soviet troops slammed into them and shoved them back. For the very first time, the German war machine had been stopped cold. But the war was about to get far bigger, because on the other side of the planet, another empire was about to make its move. Way over here in the Pacific, Japan had spent years building an empire, invading China and seizing land across Asia. The one force standing in its way was the United States and its Pacific Fleet. So Japan decided to knock it out in a single blow. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, Japanese planes appeared over the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii and attacked with no warning at all. In under 2 hours, they killed 2,403 Americans and sank or wrecked most of the fleet. Nearly half of the dead came from one ship, the USS Arizona, which exploded and took 1,177 men down with her. Japan was sure it would shatter American morale. It did the exact opposite. The next day, America declared war, and the vote in Congress was 388 to 1. And then, for reasons historians still argue about to this day, Hitler declared war on the United States too. He didn't have to. Nobody forced him. He simply chose to. And with that one decision, the most powerful industrial nation on Earth was now fully in the war against him. Now it's 1942, and the tide began to turn. First, America hit back in a way Japan had thought was flat out impossible. In April, a handful of American bombers took off from the deck of an aircraft carrier, something heavy bombers were never built to do, flew all the way to Japan and dropped their bombs on Tokyo itself. The actual damage was tiny, but the message was gigantic. Japan, which believed its home islands could never be touched, suddenly realized it could be. Then, just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the American and Japanese fleets collided near a tiny speck of land called Midway. American codebreakers had cracked the Japanese plans and knew exactly where and when they would strike. In a few brutal minutes, American dive bombers sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, the very same carriers that had hit Pearl Harbor. Japan never recovered from it. From that day on, in the Pacific, Japan was retreating. Then, deep inside Russia, came the battle that broke the back of the German army. The city was called Stalingrad. Hitler wanted it desperately, partly for the oil fields beyond it, and partly, simply, because it carried Stalin's name. What followed was 5 months of the most savage fighting of the entire war. Men battled floor by floor for a single building, room by room, hand to hand in the frozen rubble. The average life expectancy of a fresh Soviet soldier arriving in the city was measured in hours. And then, in the dead of winter, the Soviets sprang an enormous trap, surrounding the whole German army inside the city they'd come to conquer. Hitler forbade them to retreat, so they starved and froze in the ruins until, in February 1943, the broken remains of them surrendered. Nearly 2 million people were killed, wounded, or captured at Stalingrad. After that, the German army in the East would never go forward again. Now it's 1943, and the Allies stopped just defending and started hitting back. With North Africa finally cleared of Axis troops, they set their sights on Italy, and the obvious first step was the island of Sicily, right here. The problem was, it was way too obvious. As Churchill put it, anyone but a fool could see they were coming for Sicily. So British intelligence cooked up one of the strangest tricks of the entire war. Remember that dead body I mentioned at the start? Here's where it pays off. They took the corpse of a homeless man who had died back in Britain, dressed him up as a Royal Marine officer, handcuffed a briefcase to his wrist stuffed with fake top-secret war plans, and quietly floated him off the coast of Spain. The fake plan said the Allies were actually going to invade Greece and that Sicily was just a decoy. The Germans found the body, swallowed the lie whole, and rushed troops and tanks off to Greece. So when the Allies stormed Sicily, the defenses had been gutted. A dead man who never even existed had helped win a battle. And within weeks, Italy had had enough. They overthrew their own dictator, Mussolini, and switched sides. Just like that, one of Hitler's main allies was gone. Now it's 1944, and everything came to a head. For 2 solid years, Stalin had been screaming at Britain and America to open a second front in the West and take some of the unbearable pressure off Russia. Now, at last, they were ready. The plan was the biggest invasion ever attempted by anyone, a massive landing on the beaches of Normandy in occupied France. But they had the exact same problem as Sicily, multiplied by 1,000. The Germans knew an invasion was coming. They just didn't know where. So the Allies built a lie so enormous you could see it from the air. Remember that army made out of rubber? Here it is. They parked inflatable tanks, plywood aircraft, and fake landing craft all along the English coast, directly across from Calais, the shortest and most obvious crossing point. They broadcast fake radio chatter for an entire army that did not exist, and they put the famous, feared General Patton in charge of it. The Germans became completely convinced the real blow would land at Calais, so that's exactly where they kept their best divisions sitting and waiting. And then, everything came down to one thing no general could control: the weather. The invasion needed calm seas and clear skies, and a vicious storm was rolling straight in. The Supreme Allied Commander, Eisenhower, faced a brutal choice: go now or wait weeks for the next window. His chief weatherman spotted one narrow gap in the storm. Eisenhower stared at the forecast, paused, and said, "Okay, we'll go." On June 6, 1944, D-Day, 156,000 men crossed the Channel and stormed 5 beaches in Normandy under withering fire. They paid in blood, but they got their foothold. The Germans hesitated, still guarding Calais against an army made of rubber, and the door into Europe was finally kicked open. At that very same moment, far away in the east, the Soviets launched a colossal offensive of their own and shattered an entire German army group in a matter of weeks. Hitler was now being crushed from 2 sides at once. By the end of August, Paris was free. Now it's 1945, and the end came fast and brutal. Hitler threw the very last of his strength into one desperate gamble, a surprise winter attack through the Ardennes again, the same forest as 1940. For a moment, the German line bulged forward, which is why it's remembered as the Battle of the Bulge. But they had no fuel and no reserves left, and the attack burned itself out. After that, there was nothing left to stop the Allies pouring into Germany from the west and the Soviets pouring in from the east. And as those armies pushed into German-held land, they found something the world had only heard whispered rumors about: the camps. For years, the Nazis have been carrying out the deliberate, organized, industrial murder of Europe's Jews, along with Roma, the disabled, prisoners of war, and anyone else they had decided was unworthy of life. By the end, around 6 million Jewish men, women, and children had been murdered in what we now call the Holocaust. Soldiers who had already seen the absolute worst of the fighting walked through the gates of those camps and could not comprehend what they were looking at. This was what the war had truly been about. Not just lines on a map. This. In Berlin, it was over. Soviet troops fought their way street by street into the heart of the capital, while Hitler hid in a concrete bunker buried beneath the city. On April 30th, 1945, with Russian soldiers only a few hundred meters away, he killed himself. A week later, on May 8th, Germany surrendered. In Europe, after almost 6 years, the guns finally fell silent, and people flooded into the streets to celebrate. But the war was not over, because far out in the Pacific, Japan was still fighting, and it had absolutely no intention of giving up. Island by island, American forces had been clawing their way toward the Japanese mainland, and every island was bloodier than the last. On tiny places like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, Japanese soldiers fought almost to the last man, and young pilots crashed their planes straight into American ships on purpose. The closer the Americans got to Japan itself, the more they dreaded what actually invading it would cost. The estimates ran into the hundreds of thousands of dead, maybe far more. And this is where that letter finally comes in. Back in 1939, terrified that Hitler might build an atomic bomb first, A small group of refugee scientists had convinced the most famous physicist alive, Albert Einstein, to sign a letter warning the American president to start building one immediately. That single letter set off a top-secret program called the Manhattan Project. 3 years and $2 billion later, out in the desert, it actually worked. America now held a weapon that could erase an entire city with one bomb. And in August 1945, they used it. On the 6th, a bomb fell in Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second fell in Nagasaki. The scale of the death was like nothing the world had ever witnessed. On August 15th, Japan surrendered. After 6 years, the deadliest war in human history was finally completely over. When the dust settled, the numbers were almost impossible to hold in your head. Somewhere between 70 and 85 million people were dead, and most of them were not soldiers, they were civilians. Entire nations lay in ruins. The old empires of Europe were finished, and standing over the wreckage were two new superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. The very same two countries that had just won the war side by side, and they already despised each other. Within months, an invisible line was being drawn straight across Europe, splitting the continent in two, one half free, one half under Soviet control. Out of all that death, the world did try to build something to make sure it never happened again, a new organization called the United Nations, founded on a simple, desperate promise: never again. Whether the world could actually keep that promise was a whole other question. And Einstein lived another 10 years. He never stopped thinking about that letter he had signed, the one that helped bring the atomic bomb into the world. Near the end of his life, he put it as plainly as a man can. "I made one great mistake in my life," he said, "when I signed the letter to President Roosevelt recommending that atom bombs be made." The man who had helped unlock the most destructive force in all of history spent his final years wishing he never had. Because the war was over, but the weapon he helped create wasn't going anywhere. And the two giants left standing in the ruins were about to spend the next 45 years aiming it directly at each other.